Okay, so you want to understand how someone escapes a Soviet psychiatric prison. Here's the problem. The picture most people have of these places is wrong. Not slightly wrong, completely wrong. What separated the common misconception from reality is precisely where most escape attempts ended in failure: rearrest and a diagnosis that was permanently worse than the one before. Before we talk about escape, we must first establish what institutions we are actually discussing. Because Soviet psychiatric detention was not one thing, it was at least three completely distinct systems operating under the same political umbrella. The first was the ordinary civil psychiatric hospital, which held patients who genuinely needed care alongside political prisoners whose inconvenient opinions had been reclassified as symptoms. The second was the special psychiatric hospital, known in Russian as the spetspsikhbolnitsy, operated directly by the Interior Ministry rather than the health system. The third category was the transit system connecting the two, a network of transfer prisons holding cells and escorted convoys that moved patients between facilities under conditions nearly identical to criminal incarceration. Each category required a completely different strategy to exit. The most documented cases of successful exits came not through physical escape, but through the legal and medical reevaluation process, which sounds straightforward and was not. A patient committed under a diagnosis of sluggish schizophrenia, the Soviet-era classification used to pathologize political dissent, could request a review commission. The commission was composed of the same institutional psychiatrists who had made the original diagnosis. Requesting a review without the right external pressure was not an appeal. It was an invitation to receive an updated and more severe diagnosis. The patients who successfully used the review process in the 1970s and early 1980s did so because they had something attached to their names that the Soviet system was temporarily reluctant to ignore: foreign attention, a name that appeared in Western newspapers. The mathematics of external visibility were precise. A dissident with zero international profile who filed a review request had a rehospitalization rate that approached 100% within 24 months of conditional release. A dissident whose name had been published in Amnesty International materials, whose case had been raised by a Western government even once in an official communication, faced a meaningfully different calculation. The Soviet state still wanted them contained, but the cost-benefit analysis of recommitting someone whose case would generate another round of foreign press coverage shifted enough to produce conditional releases in a significant number of documented cases. Physical escape from a spetspsikhbolnitsy was, by every account from former inmates, nearly impossible from inside the facility itself. The architectural design of these institutions was not hospital design. It was prison design with medical terminology applied to the exterior. A patient found attempting physical escape was not disciplined through hospital procedure. They were treated as a security incident, transferred to a more restrictive unit, and given a substantially heavier pharmaceutical load within 48 hours of recapture. The drug protocols used in these cases, high doses of haloperidol and sulfazine, a substance that caused severe muscular pain and high fever, functioned as both punishment and incapacitation. The successful physical exits that did occur happened almost exclusively during the transfer phase, not within the facilities themselves. When a patient was moved between institutions, the security profile dropped. A single guard, sometimes two, would escort a patient through a public train station, through a city street, through a corridor that connected to the outside world in a way the facility never did. Between 1965 and 1985, a small but documented number of patients used this window. The escort had to be momentary. The patient had to be coherent enough to move quickly, which meant the pharmaceutical load had to be low enough to allow functional decision-making. And a contact on the outside had to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, which required communication that the facility's mail censorship system was specifically designed to prevent. The communication problem was its own separate architecture of difficulty. All outgoing mail from special psychiatric hospitals was read before it left the building. Incoming mail was screened. Visitors were permitted only with administrative approval, and approval was controlled by the same staff responsible for the patient's detention. The methods that actually worked were narrow: coded language and approved correspondence, references opaque enough to pass institutional review, but specific enough to convey information to a recipient who understood the system. Smuggled messages passed through the hands of released patients who agreed to carry information out on behalf of those still inside. The released patient network was the most reliable channel that operated at any scale. When a patient was conditionally discharged, they carried knowledge. They knew the transfer schedules. They knew which guards worked which shifts. They knew the pharmaceutical protocols well enough to describe to a foreign journalist exactly what was being administered and at what dosage. This information, once it reached Western psychiatrists and human rights organizations, fed directly into the advocacy campaigns that generated the external visibility that made legal reevaluation marginally possible. The escape pipeline, such as it existed, was circular. People who got out made it easier, incrementally and slowly, for the next person to get out through a legitimate process. The emigration channel opened a third pathway that operated on different rules entirely. Between 1970 and 1980, Soviet policy on Jewish immigration shifted under a combination of domestic political pressures and external incentives tied to trade negotiations with the United States. Inside the psychiatric detention system, patients who could establish Jewish heritage and who had relatives in Israel or the West gained access to a request mechanism that the Soviet state evaluated on different grounds than ordinary discharge requests. This was not a reliable channel. It was gamed, delayed, and frequently denied. But it was a channel that did not exist for patients without this specific profile. Documented cases show that the average processing time between an emigration request filed by a psychiatrically detained individual and an actual exit, when exit occurred at all, was between 2 and 7 years. The pharmaceutical dimension of escape planning is the part that most historical accounts underweight. A patient on a standard haloperidol protocol at a Soviet special psychiatric hospital was not capable of executing a complex escape plan. The drug, at the doses administered in these facilities, produced severe motor rigidity, cognitive slowing, and an emotional blunting that affected the will to act as much as the capacity to act. The patients who successfully navigated legal release processes were, in almost every documented case, patients who had found ways to reduce their actual drug intake below the level recorded in their charts, holding tablets under the tongue, inducing vomiting after liquid medication when supervision was brief, feigning compliance during observed administration, and disposing of the substance afterward. These were not sophisticated techniques. They were survival adaptations that carried serious risk of discovery and escalating treatment if caught. But without some degree of pharmaceutical resistance, the cognitive function required to maintain a coherent legal strategy across months or years of institutional pressure simply was not available. The role of Western psychiatry in the exit process is documented but rarely quantified. In 1971, the World Psychiatric Association held its Congress in Mexico City. In 1977, at the Vienna Congress, the pressure had intensified to the point where a formal investigation of Soviet practices was on the table. The Soviet All-Union Society of Psychiatrists withdrew from the World Psychiatric Association in 1983, one step ahead of a formal expulsion vote that would have carried. The significance of this for individual patients was indirect but real. International professional condemnation gave Western governments a technical framework for raising individual cases in diplomatic contexts. A foreign minister who wanted to pressure the Soviet Union on human rights could now cite not just political persecution, but violations of internationally recognized psychiatric standards. This gave the advocacy campaigns a professional legitimacy that pure human rights arguments had not achieved in isolation. The cases that worked best combined every available element simultaneously. External advocacy. Legal reevaluation requests filed at specific points in the institutional calendar, when commission composition was most likely to include at least one member with professional exposure to Western criticism. Emigration requests running in parallel through whatever administrative channel was available. Reduced pharmaceutical compliance sustained over months without detection. Maintained contact with the external network through whatever communication channel had not been closed. None of these elements worked reliably alone. Any single element, pursued without the others, was manageable by the institutional system. The cases that produced exits within a 5-year window, rather than a decade-long window, were almost uniformly the cases where all 5 elements were running at the same time, coordinated by people both inside and outside the facility who understood the specific pressure points of the Soviet psychiatric bureaucracy. The geography of exit mattered in ways that were not obvious from the outside. Facilities in Moscow were paradoxically more permeable to external pressure than facilities in remote regions, specifically because their proximity to foreign embassies and Western journalists made the cost of maintaining extreme conditions higher. The Serbsky Center, located in central Moscow, processed a disproportionate number of the patients who eventually achieved documented exits, partly because it was the facility whose practices were most thoroughly documented by the foreign press corps operating in the city. Facilities in Kazan, Chernihiv, and Dnepropetrovsk were geographically remote, more insulated from the visibility that made exit calculations shift. Patients transferred to these outer facilities faced significantly lower probability of achieving any form of release within a 5-year horizon, regardless of which exit strategy they pursued. The documented success rate across all methods combined was low by any measurement. Of the approximately 2,000 individuals estimated to have been detained in Soviet special psychiatric hospitals for political reasons between 1960 and 1986, fewer than 400 achieved documented release before the Gorbachev-era reforms began dismantling the system after 1986. Of those 400, the majority were released through conditional discharge processes that left them subject to rehospitalization on administrative order. Permanent exit from Soviet territory, through emigration or defection, represented a smaller subset still. The ones who made it out completely, who reached the West and stayed, numbered in the dozens across that entire 26-year period. Each one represented a specific and largely unrepeatable convergence of external pressure, internal strategy, pharmaceutical management, institutional timing, and a transfer corridor that briefly faced the outside world.